Welcome. My name is Jesselyn with SedonaOffice, and today we're going to be looking at the Parts Updater. The Parts Updater is a database tool that you can use to add large quantities of new parts to your database at once, or to update large quantities of existing parts all at once. So let's say you have a new vendor and they send you a new parts list, you can add all those parts, or let's say they give you a new price list, you can update existing parts with the new prices. So if we're looking here at a part, this is just a typical part in SedonaOffice. Anything on this Parts Detail tab, these are the kinds of things that the updater can update. Also on the Vendors tab, it can add new vendors. It can update anything here on the Vendors tab. If you're adding new parts, obviously this type of information is what's essential to the part, so the updater can add all that information so that you can add a new part. One thing it can't do is address anything on the Warehouse tab. A lot of people want it to do standard cost, and it can't affect standard cost because that's associated with general ledger activity, which is much more complicated. But anything here on the Vendor tab or the Part Detail tab, we can update. So the first thing I want to do is start with how do you get the Parts Updater. If you are a cloud customer, when you log into the cloud portal, you'll see there's an icon for the Parts Updater right next to the SedonaOffice icon. If you're not a cloud customer, then you have to download it from our website, and that's what I'm going to walk through with you right now. So if we pull up our web browser, here's the SedonaOffice website. We're going to go to Resources and Education, Reference Documents, and the last item on this first list here, View Downloads. And then the first item under the downloads is the Parts Updater. So if I click that, you can see it's downloading down here. And then if I open up that zip file, there's an executable. I'm going to double click that and select Run. It asks me, do I want to create a desktop shortcut? Yes, I do. And install. And it also asks me if I want to launch the Parts Updater right now. I'm not actually going to do that. There's a couple of things I want to look at with you guys first. But now, if I close out of here, you can see on my desktop, there's the Parts Updater. So now I have the updater. What I need is the list of parts that I'm going to be updating. Your vendor may have provided you with this. It may be something that you created yourself. But if neither of those is the case, you can pull a list of parts from SedonaOffice using the Parts Extractor. So if you just downloaded the Parts Updater, the Extractor came with it. If you're on the cloud, you'll notice that there's an icon for the Parts Extractor right next to the Parts Updater. So I'm going to come down to my Start menu and type Parts Extractor, and there it is, pulls it right up. Gives you a list of your databases. I'm going to select the database I want to pull my parts from, and then you have two options. Are you going to pull all the parts in your database and whatever the primary vendor is for those parts, or are you just pulling parts that are associated with a specific vendor? I'm going to leave it at all parts, pull the primary vendor. And then down below that, do you want to pull all of your parts or just the active ones or just the inactive ones? I'm going to leave it at active only and hit Start. It's going to ask me to name my new file it's creating, so I'm going to name it Active Parts and hit Save. And there we see it created a new CSV file for me. If I open that up, here's a list of all my active parts in my database with information from their primary vendor, and all of these columns on here are things that I can update using the Parts Updater. It's a lot of information. Most of the time, you're not going to be using all of this info. I've actually created a smaller list so that it's easier to see the changes that we're going to make together. So here I have a short list. Still got all of the same columns, but just a few parts so that it's easier to track the changes that we're going to be making. So we're going to be looking primarily at this first part, 5028, and you'll notice that I added a test note to this part. And if we look at in Sedona, there is no note on this part right now. I'm just going to close out of the setup for that part. And I'm going to close out of this document. So that's the first update we're going to run, a very simple update. I want to update the notes on those parts that we were just looking at in that short list. So let's run the updater. I'm going to double click to open it. The first thing that pops up are terms and conditions. So this is letting you know that the Parts Updater is a powerful tool. It can update lots of parts in your database all at once, but because of that, it also has the option or the ability to cause problems for lots of your parts at once if you use it incorrectly. So this is just letting you know, test your Parts Updater in the sandbox first. Make sure that you do a backup of your database, and then once you're confident and everything went the way you expected it to in the sandbox, then run it on your live database. If you have an issue and parts are updated incorrectly, SedonaOffice can help you, but that assistance might be billable. So that's what this is letting you know. So I'm going to click Accept and hit Next. It asks you what database are you going to be doing this on. I'm going to select our test database, Sedona Security. Hopefully you guys are selecting your sandbox. I'm going to hit Next. It asks you to select your parts list, which right now it only accepts CSV files. It no longer accepts Excel, and it does not yet accept PSA, so just CSV. And it's going to ask us to select that file, so I'm going to pick that here, that short list that we looked at. And this is the updater. Over here on the left are the columns that are listed in your CSV file. I can click in here, but it doesn't do anything. These are just for you to be able to see what you've got available. Down here at the bottom, you have your status bar. Right now it says required fields are not complete. Once I enter, right now it's saying not complete because I don't have anything entered in the updater. Once I begin to enter things, it will double check and make sure I've got everything I need in order to do the update. So for example, if we're just updating the notes, all it needs is the part code field and the notes field. Once I have those two complete, it'll agree it's complete. If I'm adding new parts, there's a lot of information that new parts need in order to be able to be added. So the system's going to require me to enter all of that before it will get rid of this required fields not complete message. But once that is complete, this will go away and the update button will highlight. Cancel obviously just closes the updater. The save layout and load layout options there, what this means is when I go to do an update, if I'm just going to be updating the notes like we're doing, I only have 2 fields I really need to play with. It'll be really quick. We don't really need to worry that much. But let's say you are adding new parts. You'll need to be mapping many different fields, entering defaults for many of those fields. And it's going to take a little while. You don't want to have to keep doing that because presumably you're going to do this once in your sandbox. You're going to do it once in your live database. And then you might need to add new parts again in the future at a later time. So instead of having to go through and map each field every single time you do it, you do the mapping once, you save the layout, and then the next time you come in, you can load that saved layout. You don't have to redo all of the mapping. It'll default it all in there for you. So up here at the top, we have a few different tabs here. This first one, the Rules tab, is just our basic options. Are we going to be updating parts, or are we going to be updating and adding new parts? That's what we're telling it here. So if I click Update Only, if it finds a part in my CSV file that it doesn't find in Sedona, it'll ignore it, it'll skip it. But if I hit Add New Parts as needed, if it finds a part in my CSV file that doesn't exist in Sedona, it'll add that part. Suppliers, you get the option also to update suppliers or to add new suppliers. This does not mean adding a new vendor to your database. If you do need to add a new vendor, you should do that first before running the updater. What this means is, if I look at the vendor tab of a part, it means adding a new vendor to this tab. So the vendor already exists in Sedona, I'm going to be adding it to this part. That's what that field is. Over here on the right, am I going to be mapping based on the SedonaOffice part code, the vendor part number, or the manufacturer part number? That's what this radio button is. Most of the time, you're probably going to be using your SedonaOffice part number. Then your checkboxes down here, map supplier becomes primary supplier. So if I'm updating supplier information, and let's say it's ADI, if I want to make ADI the primary supplier for all my parts, I can check that box, and it will make it so that ADI is primary. If I don't check that box, I can still update ADI's information, but I'm not making ADI the primary vendor for my parts. Halt on errors, we want you guys to leave that checked. So what that means is as the system's going through, if it finds a problem, it's going to stop and ask you to address the problem. It's not going to keep powering through and updating the rest of the parts. It's going to wait till the problem's resolved. Our company uses barcoding, pretty straightforward. It just means if you do have barcoding active, the system's going to double check that all of your barcodes are valid and none are duplicated. And then use default multiplier when source is blank or 0. This has to do with prices, and I will get into that more later, but for right now, all that's important to know is that if you want the prices for your parts to be 0, uncheck the box. If you do not want your prices to be 0, leave the box checked. So now these other tabs are all the different fields that you can update, that you can map to, and that you can update in Sedona. So right now you'll see that part code shows in red. That's because it's a required field. Anything that's required is going to show in red. So I'm going to map this to my part code in the CSV file. And then the other thing I'm going to do, we said we're going to be updating the notes, so I'm going to come here to my notes field, map it to the notes field in the file. And I'm going to enter a default. Let me put default note. Okay. I don't need to do anything else. If all I'm doing is updating notes, I don't need the rest of these fields. So if you guys only need to update a couple of fields, whatever it is you're updating, play with those, leave the rest of them blank. You don't need to do every single one. But let's take a peek at all of the rest of them just so we can see very quickly. Vendor supplier, some information here about not just vendors, but also the manufacturer and product lines on this tab. GL, that's what GL accounts are going to be used for this particular part. User defined is all of your custom fields, and then we've got a couple special ones under other. For example, if you're going to be updating the actual Sedona part code itself, then you can map the part code in your CSV file to the part code in Sedona, and then you would have a new column in your CSV file for the new part code, and you would map that new column to this new part code right here. It'll update all of your existing part codes to be the new codes you enter. And of course, if you are using UPC right there. The log here logs everything that you're doing in the updater. It's always going to show what you see before you. This is just you opening the updater and getting it ready. After we run the update, there's going to be more information down below about exactly what was updated. So as you can see, we mapped the part code, we mapped the notes, and our required fields warning has gone away. Everything that was required has been done. So I'm going to go ahead and click the update button. It tells me 5 parts updated without errors. That's great. If I scroll down, here's the parts. It tells me each part it found, each part it updated. If you're updating prices, it actually gives you a little bit more information about what prices it found and what it updated them to. It says not a valid part code here at the bottom. That's because it got to the next line in the CSV file, which was blank. It said, okay, that's not a part code, I'm done. So here we have the save log button. Let's say you ran into an actual error. You can try to troubleshoot it. If you were having problems troubleshooting it, you can save the log. And what it does is just creates a notepad version of exactly what we're looking at right here. And you can send that to SedonaOffice, and we can help you troubleshoot the issue. So let's go take a peek at these parts in Sedona. So here's our 5028 that we added test note in the CSV doc. And there it goes. It says test note right there. It was updated. Now I want to take a peek at another part with you. Remember from our CSV doc, which I'm going to open right now in read only because the parts updater has it open. It forces us to read only. And then see these other parts, I left the note field blank. So let's look at one of these, part 5030. Let's look at that. And let's edit that part and look at the note. See how it shows the default note. It did update the note. It updated it to the default that we selected here. We entered a default note there. So that's what the default column is for, this column on the far right here. The purpose of it is to update any item that you left blank in your CSV file. So it'll use whatever value was in your CSV file unless that value is blank, and then it uses the default. If you don't enter a default, it'll just leave the field blank. Sometimes you'll see the default fields appear in red. So let me close out of here. And let's log back into the updater just so I can show you what that looks like. So for example, if I switch to add new parts as needed, many fields become required in Sedona or in the updater. So I'm going to go look at, see now how all of these are in red, and I've got some default fields that are red too. So sometimes when default fields appear in red, it's because they are essential to the part and they can't be left blank. So your notes default will never show red because a blank note won't hurt anything. But if you're adding parts, for example, the product line, the default shows in red because the updater can't add a new part if it doesn't have a product line. So if for some reason the product line in your CSV file is missing for a part or it's misspelled on a certain part, the system will use the default that you select here. The default column has one other feature as well. If all the parts in your CSV file need to be updated to the same product line, or if all the parts should be updated to have the same note, say last updated July 25th, in this case, you don't actually have to map the field at all. So I could leave this notes field blank and just enter last updated 7/25. And then the updater will run through and update all the parts to that default that I entered. So it'll ignore the CSV file entirely and just use that note. Same thing with any of these ones that are required. If all the parts in your CSV file have the same product line, you don't actually have to select the product line column here. You can just enter that product line, and the system will run through and use that default for all of them. Okay. So we updated our notes. We did a pretty basic update. Some other common updates that I see people do are inactivating parts and updating the prices. So we're going to look at those a little bit more in detail. So let me open the parts updater again, and I want to show you what it looks like. Let's use our short list. Now this is just the basics, what it opens to. I want to show you what it looks like when I load a layout. So I'm going to click Load Layout, and I have a layout that I've saved before, all mapped. So this just means everything is mapped. That's what I named it. And see now here, I don't have to run through and do it again. It's all already mapped. I want to show you guys down here the inactive field. I can map this to the inactive field in my CSV file. So if you wanted to inactivate a bunch of parts at once, you could add a column to your CSV file for inactive, put inactive in every single row, and then upload it. But you don't have to do that. If you're going to be updating a bunch of parts at once, you don't even have to map this. You could just leave it blank and then select inactive here, and it'll inactivate all the parts in your CSV file. You could also activate all the parts in your CSV file, or just leave it at no change. And you don't need the rest of this, obviously, if you're going to be just inactivating parts. So that one's also pretty simple. How about prices? That one gets a little bit more complicated. Let's double check what our prices currently are for our test part here. So let's look at 5028 is our test part. And right now our sales price $129.25, our service price $117.50. So let's look at our short list. The sales price here, that matches what we just saw on our part. Let's update it. Let's just round it up to 130. And the service price here also matches what we saw on the part. Let's round that up to 120. So there's 3 different ways that you can update your prices. The first way is just to map the price on your CSV file to the price in Sedona. And so what this is going to do when we map this in the parts updater is it's going to go through and it's going to say, what does my CSV say? It says 120. I'm going to update it to 120. So let's walk through and see that. All right. Okay, so I'm going to map my part code and then my service price here. Let's go and pick our service price. And then our sales price here. I'm going to go ahead and click my sales price. And then as soon as I do that, if we look at the vendor tab, these items become required. That's going to happen anytime you're updating price, and that's because we know that our prices are in our CSV file. They're all listed there. They're all good, but the updater doesn't know that. And if it comes across a price that's 0 or that's blank, it wants to be able to update that based on the purchase cost. So that's why it automatically makes all of this required. It's not actually going to use this. Our CSV file is complete. It has all the prices, so it won't be using this information, but it wants it just in case. So let's go ahead and map that. Here's our purchase cost. If I can find it, there it is. Supplier is my primary supplier here, and it requires a default for that. It's not going to use the default, it's just going to use what's in our CSV, but this is a just in case. And then purchase quantity is supplier quantity. Okay, so let's hit update. 5 parts updated without errors. And if we scroll down, you can see we have more information. Like I was talking about before, it's telling us what price it found and what price it updated it to be. So you can see here, it's already telling us it updated it to 120 and 130 like we told it to. Let's go look at that part in Sedona. There it is, 130 and 120. Service price 2 is also another one you can map to. We didn't do that just now, but you can. If you use any of the other prices, the updater can't update those, just price 1 and 2, not prices 3 through 10. Okay, so what if we don't want to update the prices to be a specific number that we entered in our CSV file? What if instead we want to update the prices to be some percentage of the purchase cost? So if that's the case, let's reopen our updater here, select our database and our file. I'm going to map the part code. Then here for my prices, I'm actually not going to map the service price. In this case, I'm saying I don't have a specific price that I want you to be already listed in my file. I want you to do the math for me, take my purchase cost, multiply it by this amount I give you, and that's going to be my price. So we're just going to give it a very simple multiplier, just so you guys can easily see. I'm going to give it a multiplier of 2. And sales price, there it is. We'll just do that as 3, just so you guys can clearly see the difference. And then vendor supplier, again, it wants this information. This time it's actually going to use it. It needs to know what the purchase cost is if it's going to update prices based on that cost. And it needs to know what supplier as well, the purchase cost for which supplier. It needs that information. So let's go through this again, primary supplier. And if I had saved the layout last time, I wouldn't have to re-enter this information. Purchase cost. Alrighty, so let's hit update. 5 parts updated, again, down here. So you can see it found the original price was 120 and it updated it to be 100. That's because the purchase cost is 50. So let's take a look at that in the actual part. If I look here at the vendor, see my purchase cost is 50. And so that's why here I said to multiply it by 2. So that's why my service price is 100. And I said to multiply this by 3. That's why my sales price is 150. So then the final way that you can update your prices, and we're not actually going to walk through this because I can't imagine it's going to be used very often, but just so you know, this option here on the first tab, if you guys recall this, basically what this is saying is when I go to update my prices, let's say that I do map my service price. I'm going to map my service price, I'm going to map my sales price, and I'm going to enter a multiplier of some kind, let's say 2. So what I'm telling the system here is look at my CSV file and use the service price. But what if my service price in my CSV file is 0 or it's blank? Because I have this box checked, use default multiplier when source is blank or 0, if it does come across a blank or a 0, it's going to look at this multiplier and it's going to multiply the purchase cost by that amount to get the price. So it's basically, I'm telling the system that the 2 versions that we just did together, do them both. Pick whatever value I have in the CSV file. If you don't find it, use the multiplier instead. So we could have done that from the beginning, and in fact we did. I put a 1 in there the first time just so that it would accept our entry. But the third way that you can do your updates is if you don't want it to have a price, if you for some reason want to update these parts to a price of 0, you can uncheck that box and then map your prices, and then when you hit update, it's just going to update everything to 0, as long as you have 0 in your CSV file, obviously, which we're not going to walk through because I don't think people normally want to update their part prices to 0. But that's essentially it. That's the parts updater beginning to end. So thank you guys for joining me, and happy updating.